Greetings, statisticians. I am Patrick Smith. This is Disenthrall. Today we have with me my partner in victimless crime, Kaysen. Welcome, Kaysen. We also have...
Hello.
We also have very special guest with us today, Phil. Phil is a professional statistical analyst specializing in predictive analytics and classification. He calls himself a voluntarian, a consensualist, a radical capitalist, peacenik, and various other terms that all mean the same thing. Welcome to the show, Phil. It's good to have you.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So the subject of this show is one that started a month or two ago when I came across another news story, one of the news stories that we're all used to seeing, where they talk about something that happened and then they reference scientific studies that said something or that made some kind of truth claim based on the results of their analysis. And I find that no one understands, how should I say this? Very few people have the tools in their toolbox to accurately or to reliably interpret the results of these scientific studies. And so I started by doing a deep dive into this particular story, the story of the recent jury that awarded $289 million to Mr. Johnson, which we'll start by reading the story, but then I want to actually dive in deeper, go behind the story. I found another website that tells the same story, makes the same news story, but hits it from a different angle, and both stories link to the same study. So then we're going to go look at the study itself, we're going to look at the results of that study, and then we're going to apply the massive brain sitting next to me to help show exactly how difficult it might be to make a truth claim or an interpretation of the data based on the study, and all the factors that might go into making the study more or less valid or applicable, or all the crazy stuff you got to watch out for. I fully expect that you and me are going to a lot of it might go over our heads, and that's fine. That's kind of the point. We need to realize that it requires actual training and skill to make interpretations of these studies. So let's get into it. Here we go. This is the CNN story that kicked it all off. Jurors awarded $289 million to a man they say got cancer from Monsanto's Roundup weed killer. San Francisco jurors just ruled that Roundup, the most popular weed killer in the world, gave a former school groundskeeper terminal cancer. They awarded him $289 million in damages, mostly to punish the agricultural company Monsanto. DeWayne Johnson, not The Rock, DeWayne Johnson's victory could set a massive precedent. It was the first to go to trial because doctors said he was near death. Let's see. CNN reported that last year, more than 800 patients were suing Monsanto, claiming Roundup gave them cancer. Since then, hundreds more plaintiffs, including cancer patients, their spouses, and estates, have also sued Monsanto. After 3 days of deliberation, they awarded $250 million in punitive damages and $39 million in compensatory. That's how you say that word. Like in English. After the verdict, they issued a statement saying it stands by the studies that suggest Roundup does not cause cancer. We will appeal this decision and continue to vigorously defend this product, which has a 40-year history of safe use and continues to be a vital, effective, and safe tool for farmers and others. Johnson, 46, applied Roundup weed killer 20 to 30 times per year while working as a groundskeeper for a school district near San Francisco, his attorney said. He testified that during his work, he had 2 accidents in which he was soaked with the product. The first accident happened in 2012. 2 years later, he was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Apparently, he has lesions on 80% of his body. And the big questions at stake were whether Roundup can cause cancer, and if so, whether Monsanto failed to warn consumers about the product's cancer risk. The jury sided with Johnson on both. In March 2015, the WHO research on cancer said the key ingredient in Roundup, glyphosate, is probably carcinogenic to humans. For the herbicide glyphosate, there was limited evidence of carcinogenicity in humans for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, the report states. Let's see. But Monsanto has long maintained it doesn't cause cancer, and the IARC report is greatly outnumbered by studies saying that it's safe. More than 800 scientific studies. The US EPA, the National Institutes of Health, and regulators around the world have concluded that glyphosate is safe for use and does not cause cancer. He highlighted the agricultural health study, which studied the effects of pesticide. So you can kind of see where this is just another news story that's, making references to a scientific study. And I find that well, first of all, most people never actually click through and look at the study involved. But, even less so, people are less capable or they don't have the tools, they don't have the skills to interpret this data. So I wanted to do that today. The next story that I ran into that hit it from the other direction was Reason. Well, they actually I think CNN was pretty unbiased, but Reason makes a statement based on the results of the scientific study. The $289 million verdict against Monsanto is scientifically outrageous. I'm truly sorry that he's suffering from NHL, but years of scientific research has determined that it is exceedingly unlikely, despite the outrageous verdict of a California jury on Friday, that he contracted his cancer from the herbicide glyphosate. And then they basically make the case that the juries awarded it based on feels and ignored the evidence. And then they directly link us to the same scientific study that the other news report linked us to, which we have here on PubMed.gov. So we have a news story, a news source editorializing a scientific study, and I wanted to dive in deeper. Like I said, I want us to look at the words of this is just the summary page of this study. So I think the best way for us to do this maybe is I'll read this, and then maybe you can stop me if you have something important to add, or if you have like I'll just give some commentary and then just punch me when I get something wrong. Because I'm going to read this like a layman would and try and understand it like a layman would try and understand it, and then maybe ask you questions, or we can just go from there.
All right.
So there's two pieces of this, right? This is behind a paywall. The actual study is behind a paywall. I think it's like 40 or 60 bucks for the average person to even see the actual study with the in-depth results. This is just the summary page. Glyphosate use and cancer incidence in the agricultural health study. So the background is it's the most commonly used herbicide. We kind of already have talked about all this. The International Agency for Research on Cancer said it's probably carcinogenic. We've kind of already talked about this. So they, let's see. This study is a prospective cohort of licensed pesticide applicators from North Carolina and Iowa. So there's two states sort of reporting in. We updated the previous evaluation of glyphosate with cancer incidence from registry linkages through 2012 and 2013. Lifetime days and intensity-weighted lifetime days of glyphosate use were based on self-reported information. So that right there jumps out to me, the layman. Self-reported information tells me that you're basically asking people their opinions, and they're giving you their opinions on what's going on. Now, granted, like, it's usually pretty clear to a person if they've been diagnosed with cancer, so maybe the self-reported information is more accurate than maybe normal self-reporting would be. Well, but isn't the self-reporting nature like one red flag for this might being a weaker study?
Yes, actually, that's the first note I have in this specific thing.
Take it away.
The self-reporting thing, I don't think that was actually applied to their cancer diagnosis. I think that was actually, I assume that was not part of the questionnaire, and actually, I don't know. I didn't read that far into it. But where I'm really worried about the self-reported information is when they're talking about levels of glyphosate exposure, because that's something that is, especially if it's like 20 years ago, somebody is not going to have the best memory on that. That being said, sometimes you have to take what you have, and this may be one of those instances where you take what you have. But again, it will add a certain level of error to the analysis.
So the lifetime days, meaning the number of days that they were exposed to the chemical, is self-reported. Intensity, how much they were exposed to, is self-reported. So there's a lot of self-reported stuff based on memory. And the enrollment, so the initial questionnaire, correct me if I'm wrong, from enrollment means that they questioned people once between 93 and 97, and then they followed up with all the people that they could still get a hold of from 99 to 2005.
Right.
Okay. So I'm good so far?
Yes. Okay. Yeah, and there's actually a note in the actual study that they they specifically only counted data points that had data for both questionnaires. So
okay,
yeah.
And we should also state up front, like, I have no bias in either direction for this study and this topic of Monsanto and Roundup. I'm not educated enough to have formed an opinion on it. I know that some of our viewers will have strong opinions on this topic. Do you have any biases or preconceived notions about the topic that people should take into account when listening to your advice on this particular? Like, we should be open with our biases, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I wouldn't say I have any preconceived notions about it, but I'm not a huge fan of Monsanto as a company. Mm-hmm. But that is also, like, I see issues with my opinion there, so I try not to take it very seriously. But if there's a bias on my end, it's probably going to be against Monsanto.
Okay. Okay. Well, hey, it's good to say it up front, right?
Yeah.
All right. So let's move on. We estimated incidence ratios, RRs, and 95% confidence intervals using Poisson. Is that French? What is that?
It is French. It means fish. It's Poisson. It's actually named after the statistician, the French statistician who coined the Poisson process, which gets
it's like an industry standard, basically.
No. So there's actually I have issues with why they used Poisson regression here. I don't want to go too deep into it. I'll explain it a little bit more later on, but I think it has to do with what kind of data they were able to have as far as counts of people in these quartiles versus tertiles versus et cetera. But in general, when you're looking at a continuous input and a Bernoulli output, which would a 1 or a 0 success or failure output, which in this case would be, I'm explaining it a little too much already, but in this case...
This is the point I want to make.
Yeah.
Do you hear these words that he's using? Have you heard many of these words? Do you understand the meaning of these words as he's using them? Do you understand what incident rate ratios and confidence intervals are and Poisson regression? Like, the stuff he's saying, this is what... To even read the summary page for this study.
Well, there are ways.
Right?
So in defense of the common reader, there are ways if you can kind of take a few specific key points. There are ways to kind of gloss over all this and just spot the key points that are important.
And I think we should do that probably at the end of the video. Like, give people some basic tools that they could use, maybe.
Okay.
But I think maybe like the most important thing to realize here is that you have to have skills to interpret this, and you can't just read this and know what you're talking about.
Yeah, but to get to the point that before, I would have actually used what's called a logistic regression model, and just from initial reading, based on the continuous input. And all that means is that you're taking a continuous input and predicting a success or failure, be that cancer or no cancer in this case. So I'm not exactly sure why they used a Poisson regression. It may be an industry standard for this type of study in medicine. I've heard of Poisson regression used for diagnostic tests or medicine viability tests, but I'm not exactly sure why they used it.
So all statistical tests were two-sided. What does that mean?
That just means that you're testing a. I think it would be best for me to get into that later.
Okay, fair enough. All right, so results. This is the results and the conclusions. These are the power paragraphs, right? Among 54,251 applicators, that means out of basically 54,000 participants, 44,000 used, or about 45,000 used glyphosate. That means that they're basically measuring the self-reported responses for 45,000 people, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, no. So this is 45,000 people actually confirmed use of glyphosate.
Okay.
And the remaining of the 54,000 did not.
So they talked to 54,000 and basically got 45,000 that used it. Okay.
Right. And what this would mean is that the remaining about 10,000 would be used as a control group. Think of it that way, as they did not use glyphosate. Because in order to actually get some sort of information on whether or not glyphosate is connected to cancer or whatever, you have to have a control group of people who did not use it, and so you can compare the difference between the two.
Okay, so there were 54,000 licensed pesticide applicators, and about 10,000 of them would be used as a control because they claimed that they had not had contact with glyphosate.
Right.
Okay, cool. So including 5,700 incident cancer cases. So incident cancer case would mean out of the 45,000, 5,700 had cancer?
Yes, I believe that's what it's saying.
Okay. In unlagged analysis, here's another key word that can change how you interpret the data.
I'm sorry, I'm kind of
No, you're good.
Because this isn't really all that important, but the 5,779 could be. This is what's confusing me, is why that's 79.3% of all cases, being the 5,779 incident cancer cases. That's clearly not 79% of either the 45,000 or the 54,000. So I'm not really sure what they're stating there.
Very good catch. Very good catch. In unlagged analyses, can you tell us what unlagged versus lagged analyses would be?
Yes, it means over time. So unlagged would mean no time difference, and lagged would mean a time difference. So you can have a lag of 1, 2, 5, 20 years, and that would mean that you're testing how this corresponds to maybe in terms of this specific case, you may be, if you're looking at a 5-year lag, you're saying, okay, well they started glyphosate exposure on year 1, they developed cancer, or at least were diagnosed with cancer, or at least we have confirmation of a diagnosis of cancer by year 5.
So an unlagged analysis would only look at the initial state?
Right. It would look at either irrespective of time or more appropriately at the same time. So if they get cancer the same year or that they have that they had exposure.
Okay. Okay. All right. Glyphosate was not statistically. Okay, so this is interesting. Glyphosate was not statistically significantly associated with cancer at any site. So that means that work site, I'm assuming, like there wasn't like a higher incidence at one site.
Either that or site, like as far as body parts, like focusing like skin cancer or liver cancer.
So like on their hands, that might have been closer to the chemical or something like that?
Possibly.
Okay.
Yeah. So, but it could just mean Iowa versus North Carolina. I'm not entirely sure.
Okay. So yeah, see, another ambiguity that could be interpreted. However, among applicators in the highest exposure quartile, there was an increased risk of acute myeloid leukemia compared with never users. So again, compared to the control group that we just talked about, with highest exposure quartile, that means the people that were exposed in the top 25% of self-reported exposures to the chemical, there was an increased risk of a specific type of cancer, AML, compared with the control group. Now, this is the first time we've seen these numbers, and this, to me, as a layman, I see this as the core result that you get out of a statistical analysis of data. And I'm not sure, is it typically called RR and CI? I thought, and then P trend? I'm used to seeing different abbreviations here.
Right, so this goes into the tests that they're using. So the Poisson regression test is used in this case to it's used to compare two categorical variables, one of which is ordinal, meaning it has a logical order to it. So just kind of a quick definitional statement. So you've got two different kinds of categorical variables, nominal and ordinal. Nominal would be something like male, female, or red, blue, green, categories that have no logical order to them. But ordinal would be something like A, B, C, D on a test or something, where you have a very clear hierarchy in the order. So in this case, you have a hierarchy in the order through the quantiles, or the quartiles rather, because you're looking at, you know, a quartile between quartile 0 and quartile 1. That's your lowest exposure group. Quartile 1 and quartile 2 being your next exposure group up, and so on. So what the P trend is essentially the trend is actually a subscript. Generally. So what it means is it's the p-value for the hypothesis test over the trend. We'll get into hypothesis tests sometime in the next few minutes.
So we're about to hit on a bunch of these little result groupings, RR, CI, and p-trend numbers. Can you give us, is now the appropriate time for you to kind of give us a layman's view of what these numbers mean?
Yeah. I actually am not, I don't use Poisson regression, so I'm just going to give you the very basic stuff because I don't even know, like the in-depth. But the RR is, I actually forgot, it's something ratio, but that's just the test
incidence rate ratio.
Rate ratio, thank you. That's just the test statistic. And in general, if you see something that's labeled RR or T or capital F or Z, then that's probably some sort of test statistic, or lowercase r. You know, it's for the correlation coefficient. Regression stuff. No, yeah. The moral of the story is that's the statistic that you're trying to test against some probabilistic or some probability distribution.
So 2.44 is a ratio of a rate of cancer in the test group. I don't know how to calculate it. It's calculated through the contingency table of counts between, you know, cancer, yes, cancer, no cancer, and the quartiles. So you put that in a cross table, you figure out, you know, how many are in each, and the rate ratio is calculated from that. And I assume it's something having to do with the, like over the column sums or something, but I'm not sure. Now, the confidence interval, though, is something that you get out of any statistical analysis, right? It's how confident you are that your result is accurate.
Yes. So the confidence interval is one of the most notoriously interpreted statistical concepts. But yeah, it's essentially just saying, okay, 95% confident that this rate ratio is between these two numbers, and if you see your test statistic in front, somewhere in between the confidence interval, or somewhere in between the two numbers for the confidence interval, then it's a good bet that that confidence interval is the confidence for the test statistic. So that's what it would be in this case. So the goal here when you're looking at a confidence interval is usually to identify whether or not 0 is inside that interval. Now what I don't quite understand here, and this could just be my lack of understanding of Poisson regression. I don't use it enough to remember. But if the P trend is 0.11 and the confidence interval is for a 5% significance, which is for the 95% confidence interval, then why is 0 not within that confidence interval? So I think the confidence interval is calculated somewhat differently than the hypothesis test in this case. I'm not sure what.
As an additional preparation, let me see if I can jog your memory with vagaries that I remember from my. So, as an additional preparation for the show, I talked to another friend of mine who is a doctor and is very familiar with looking at the results of medical studies, and he seemed very comfortable with this Poisson regression, so maybe it's more common in medical stuff. I don't know. But he basically said if it includes one, or sorry, if it's if the CI includes one or less, then then it includes absolutely no association. So if it's got to be above one.
Right, and actually, you did just remind me. I just did something stupid. So the word ratio actually should have tipped me off. Anytime you have a ratio in your test statistic, you're not looking for 0 in the confidence interval. You're looking for 1, because this is an issue of subtraction versus division. So if you subtract 2 equal numbers, and this is kind of a heuristic, it's not exactly what's happening here, but if you subtract 2 equal numbers, then you get 0. So that is the indication that these numbers are, in fact, equal, if 0 is within your confidence interval.
So if the confidence interval includes 1,
right,
then you can't say within a 95% confidence that there is a correlation. So this would be I as a layman, true or false, would be able to interpret this as saying there's no scientific correlation that with applicators in the highest exposure quartile, there is no statistical association between AML and glyphosate.
What you can say is that this study does not provide statistically significant results.
Okay, that's very precise. So this is it's complicated, but the reason I wanted to do this show was to show you how complicated it is. What is p-trend?
P-trend is the p-value for the hypothesis test.
What is that?
So a quick overview of a hypothesis test. A hypothesis test is testing 2 different hypotheses, a null hypothesis and an alternative hypothesis. And the goal is the alternative hypothesis. The null hypothesis is the default assumption, and the goal of the study to get positive results, or significant results rather, is to reject that default hypothesis, being the null, in favor of the alternative. And the alternative is what gives us significant results. So in this case, we have a null hypothesis,
which is no cancer. They start from an assumption of there is no association.
Right, the null hypothesis being that there is no association, which in terms of the rate ratio would be, okay, the null hypothesis would imply that the rate ratio is equal to 1, because if the rates are different, then they're going to be or if the rates are equal. Let me kind of backtrack. If there is no association, then the rates of cancer between your
control and exposure group,
right, exactly, are going to be the same, which would give you a ratio of 1.
A rate ratio of 1.
Right.
Okay.
Now, due to variability and just the world and life, you're not usually going to get something clean results like that. So you have to match it up against a probability distribution. Mm-hmm. And the idea is that, well, at what point do does our sample sufficiently indicate that our default hypothesis is false? Mm-hmm. So the way we do that is we assume that the default hypothesis is true, and if the probability of getting our sample are worse, or a sample that departs as much or more than ours does from the default assumption, if the probability of that happening is sufficiently low, then you can reject the null hypothesis in favor of the alternative hypothesis, which in this case would be that there is a relationship.
Okay. And that's why this 95% number seems to be pretty standard for most studies in this area. Like you're looking for 95. That means you're 95% confident that there's between a 0.94 and a 6.32 chance.
Well, so
this would mean like you could be less than 1 times likely to get cancer, or you could be 6 times more likely to get cancer from a high exposure quartile.
It's similar to that. I don't want to jump to that because again, I don't know how the rate ratio is specifically calculated.
We're gonna trudge on and probably hit it a few more times.
But to the point of the p-value, so the p-trend is in this case the p-value, and what that is telling you is actually the probability that you get that given the null hypothesis, if you assume your null hypothesis, the p-value is the probability that you do get, if you pull a random sample, that you get your sample or worse.
Okay.
As of a departure from that null hypothesis.
Okay, and that's why they say, though this association was not statistically significant because the CI included 1.
Right.
Okay. Okay, got it. So what this means is that the study shows that there is not a statistical association between the highest exposure quartile and an increased risk of this specific type of cancer. You have to read every word in every sentence is kind of what I'm trying to get across here, because not all 45,000 applicators had this type of cancer. There was 5,700 people that had a type of cancer, right? So this is a subgroup of results here. Subgroup is another important concept that we'll probably talk about now. So though this association was not statistically, results for AML were similar with a 5-year and 20-year exposure lag. So now we have 2 more sets of results for this specific type of cancer with a time lag, which kind of talks about what we said earlier. So with no time lag, that was the result. With a 5-year time lag, that was the result. And with a 20-year lag, and another thing changed here. The first one we were talking about highest quartile. This one we're also talking about highest quartile. This one we've switched to tertile, which is like that means the third, right? So the top third, which is more people than the top quarter. So they included more people here, and they used a 20-year exposure lag. So if you wait 20 years after the exposure, and you look at the top third people, then how do the numbers change? You have your risk ratio as now 2.04. The 95% CI is 1.05. Notice that it no longer includes 1, right? So this one includes 1. This one no longer includes 1, with a p-trend of 0.04. So maybe we can talk through this one now in the same way. With the 20-year exposure lag, looking at the top third, this seems to say that there is a small statistically significant association with a 20-year exposure lag with the top third exposure people. Did I do it? Did I do it right?
Right. So there's that would seem to imply on first reading that there is a statistically significant relationship between 20 years after heavy glyphosate use and AML.
Okay, this specific type of cancer, which is not the type of cancer that the guy in the news story got. He had NHL.
No. Yeah, and in fact, this is one of the things, and I do want to get back to this the abstract, but this is actually one of the things that's most egregious about this ruling, is that let's see, where is it? The non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, which is what he had, right?
Yes.
Do you want to know what the p-trend on that was?
Yes.
It was 0.95.
0.95.
Yeah, the p-value for that was 0.95. For non-Hodgkin lymphoma B cell, it was 0.86.
So I guess I still don't perfectly understand what p-trend means then. I think I have a decent understanding of the CI numbers.
Well, what that means is that given the null hypothesis that there is, again, through the definition of p-value, given the null hypothesis that you have, that there's no connection, then the probability of your group having as much non-Hodgkin lymphoma or more than they have is 95%.
So can we just state this in English? So I'm looking at this result here.
Well, the moral of the story on that one is that it is egregiously unlikely that there's any connection to non-Hodgkin lymphoma. Like
I'll pull that. Yeah. I pulled that up on screen here in a second. I just want to stay on the trail.
Yeah.
So looking at this, can we state this in English? So there is a 0.04%. Is that what p-trend means? Can I say it like this? There's a 0.04% chance that there's a 95% association. Like, how do you say this in English?
So essentially, the easy way to say this is that there's a 4% chance So these are done in proportions. So you have to multiply it by 100 to get to your percentage. But this is a 4% chance that you have that you're assuming that it doesn't cause cancer, that glyphosate doesn't cause cancer. You have a 4% chance that you have this much cancer in your group from people who have used glyphosate.
This much cancer meaning what?
As much as that has shown up. So this much more cancer among high glyphosate users.
How much more? What number tells us how much more?
Well, that would be the rate ratio.
Oh, the rate ratio.
Yeah, and again, it's not a direct.
So does this mean you're 2 times more likely in this tertile?
I would suspect it's something similar to that.
Okay.
I believe that's probably what is calculated.
So it doesn't tell us like what the base this doesn't refer to what the control group's ratio is. I guess we would have to look up that number ourselves, right? So 5,700 out of 54,000.
Right. Well, you can. Yeah. No, it doesn't.
Okay. So just saying that we're 2 times more likely after 20 years of being in the highest exposure tertile.
Yeah. Again, I don't want to.
I'm just trying to like.
I don't want to cement that statement that it's 2 times more likely because again, I don't know how the rate ratio is, but it's something similar to that. I can tell you that.
Okay. So
I have some context for you.
Oh, let me try one more thing. So the P trend tells us that there's a 4% chance that you're twice as likely,
or more,
twice or more likely. Mm-hmm. Oh, the CI means that you're. Oh, so the CI is the range of the RR.
Right.
That we're 95% confident. So we're 95%. I'm finally getting clarity. Okay, cool. So we're 95% confident that the RR, the rate ratio, the additional chance of you getting cancer, we're 95% confident that the chance of you getting cancer falls between 0.05 more to 3.97 times as likely of getting cancer. Did I say that right? Oh, that'd be awesome. We're 95% confident
similar.
that the RR falls between 1.05 and 3.97.
Yes.
All right. I feel like I achieved something. Thank you.
and that's generally the cookie cutter way of interpreting a confidence interval is that, we are 95% confident that the rate ratio for tertile 3 falls between 1.05 and 3.97.
So they're basically, because if it's 1, that means there's no correlation. So 0.05 would basically mean you're 0.05 times more likely. So on the low end, there's hardly any effect, and it could be almost 4 times as likely in that group.
Right.
Okay, what were you saying, Kason? Sorry, I just wanted.
Yeah,
I had that epiphany moment, and I wanted to get it out while it was live. Yeah.
Good. I'm glad you had an epiphany. I'm still like, wow, every statistician could definitely be a lawyer and do just fine. So I was Googling about acute myeloid leukemia, and because you were talking about twice as likely or thereabouts. Apparently, in the U.S., it's new cases of acute myeloid leukemia are 4.3 per 100,000. So even if you doubled that, you're talking less than 10 in 100,000 chances, which I guess might lead into, and Phil, correct me if I'm wrong, might lead into the idea of not statistically significant because the number of people who get that are so small relative to other forms of cancer that are out there. Am I understanding that correct? Is that why they might have said not statistically significant?
I wouldn't necessarily say that that implies a lack of statistical significance. However, putting it in that context, so you said it was what 4 or 5 out of 100,000?
That is correct, and it makes up 1.1% of all U.S. cancer cases in 2018 thus far.
Right. So thinking about it that way,
it's a very small slice of the pie.
Yeah. So if you've got 4 out of 100,000, we've only tested about 54,000. So about 2 people came up with assumingly be about 2 people out of this would normally have AML, and maybe 3 or 4 do after the exposure. So that would actually have some serious consequences on your validity because of small sample size.
I'm still tripping on this. So this is it's like I can read this now. There's a 4% chance that you're twice as likely if you're 20 years later and have high exposure.
Yeah. Again, I don't want to commit exactly to the twice as likely.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
Something similar to twice as likely.
Okay. And then so let's do the conclusion and then maybe dive into the stuff that you wanted to pull out from the actual study, because we have the actual study too. And
before we do that,
yes,
I want to see it. So there are 2 things just in this last sentence that I want to point out that I want to see if you caught.
In conclusions or in the results?
In the results, just in that last sentence. That
okay. In the last sentence.
Yeah.
Results for AML were similar with a 5-year and a 20-year exposure lag. Is there something in that sentence that I missed? The only thing that was significant to me was that both of these included 1, so that I disregarded them as a risk, really. And this is the one that is just barely over 1.
Mm-hmm. Well, so the thing that kind of jumped out at me, there are 2 things that jumped out at me. So one is the change of the context. So you're changing context between quartiles and tertiles, because you're no longer looking at the top quarter, you're looking at the top third.
I pointed that out. Yeah.
And additionally, and I may be pointing something out that doesn't need to be pointed out, but if it's not listed in the results, if it's not stated that there's a correction in the results, then this should raise a red flag. It doesn't necessarily mean something's going on here, but it should be a red flag. So we have 3 p-values here, and if this is not corrected for, which it might be, I didn't see it in my read through, but I didn't have time to really go and dig down into it. But if it's not corrected for, then this would actually be an example of p-hacking. And
p-hacking,
yeah,
that sounds so awesome.
Again, like, I don't want to specifically accuse them of that, because they may have corrected for it, and I just didn't spot it in the lecture or in the material. But
that's something else you'd have to look for. You'd have to make sure when you're interpreting these results that they didn't do that.
Right, exactly. Yeah. But even if you're reading the results like this, if it's not stated there, it should raise some sort of alarm bell, like, this might be something. So the idea behind the hypothesis test is that you have so 0.05 translates to 1 out of 20. So what that means is that if there are no real results, if there's not an actual connection, then 1 out of 20 tests will still tell you that there is. Mm-hmm. But if you're doing that with 3 different tests, which we are right now, you have to look at that differently and say, okay, well, what's the probability that at least one of these tests gives us significant results? So you say, you multiply that 95 percentile, that 0.95, by 3, subtract that by 1, and that's your new probability. So 0.95, not multiply it, you raise it to 3. So you multiply it by itself 3 times. So 0.95 raised to 3 is going to be smaller than 0.95. So that's going to actually raise the probability of what's called a type 1 error, which means that you get significant results when there is no actual significance. So
I love hearing you talk.
Well, thank you.
I just want to do it all the time until I finally figure out what the hell you're saying.
But the moral of the story is that your p-value needs to be either lower or corrected for in order for this to remain significant. So again, they may have corrected for it and I didn't spot it, but if they don't mention that, and they might not mention it because it's assumed, but it shouldn't be assumed because this is rampant in a lot of studies. But if it's not mentioned in the results, I would have some suspicion of p-hacking.
Okay. And somebody asked a question like, who paid for the study? That's not apparent. That's not apparent.
I don't care who paid for the study. I care how the study was carried out. I don't care who paid for it.
Okay. So the thing that I took away from this is that for AML, they basically drilled down into smaller and smaller subgroups until they found one where there was, like, a confidence interval above 1. But at this point, yeah, So you're not dealing with the full 45,000 people. You're dealing with a subgroup that fits this, and only for AML. That's another thing. So in this large prospective cohort study, no association was apparent between glyphosate and any solid tumors or lymphoid malignancies overall, including NHL, which is the one in the court case, and its subtypes. There was some evidence of increased risk of AML among the highest exposed group that requires confirmation. That's what we talked about. And they even said that, even that requires confirmation, probably due to multiple factors that we've already discussed, right? Okay, so, so we actually obtained access to the actual study that's behind this paywall. Is there anything, I just want to show people what that looks like, and then ask you, is there anything in here that that people might be interested to see or learn about, like something that changes maybe how we see the summary or conclusion, or any problems that you see in here?
So the main things that I saw were just kind of bolstering what I originally caught in the abstract. So there was that issue of the difference in the model. And again, that may be the way they were forced to sample. But if you have a continuous input and a success or a failure or in output, then a statistician would immediately go to binomial logistic regression. So the fact that they didn't do that makes me question. Again, there may be some issues with the subject matter that change that, and I don't know. So that may just be my lack of knowledge, because I don't know a lot about medical testing or anything like that.
So these are the ages. This is like the basic statistics on the people that they studied. Most were male because men do all the dangerous work.
Well, you're making the assumption that glyphosate is dangerous.
Well, no, I just mean, well, I guess it's not dangerous to manage landscaping.
Yeah, well, usually landscapers are male. So.
Yeah, let's see. States we got. I'm just looking for anything interesting here.
By the way, another issue with linking this study to the court case.
Smoking.
The man in the court case developed cancer 2 years after, or he was diagnosed rather with cancer 2 years after his incidents with glyphosate, and the statistical significance here didn't even happen until 20 years. After exposure. So
very good point. Very good point. I'm just looking for anything else. They go into cigarette smoking, obviously. Family history of cancer, and then they break it down by what type of cancer, the site, the place there was cancer. Okay, so you wanted to mention something on the NHL risk RRs, right?
Oh, I was just saying, so the p-value. So remember, the p-value is the p-value indicates your significance. The smaller the p-value, the more the significance. The larger the p-value, the less the significance. So if you look at the p-value for non-Hodgkin lymphoma, you've got a very high p-value.
Okay.
As close to 1 as not as close to 1 as you can get, but it's very close to 1, which tells you that is almost, the results for that are basically non-existent.
Okay, so this is saying that there's now a 95% chance that it's between 0.64 and 1.2, and that's so far below 1.
So this is one of those things that's you can call it a pet peeve, but it is actually mathematically not accurate for you to say that.
Awesome.
So the confidence interval is not a probabilistic. I mean, it is a probabilistic statement, but not in the way that most people state it. So you state you just stated the confidence interval as a 95% chance.
Oh, there's a 95% chance that there is a 0.87 times more likely.
No.
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 Ah.
It is not a. So what that is statement, and nobody's going to understand this, but I'll say it anyway.
All right.
What that 0.95 is saying is that assuming there is no connection, then you have a 0.95 chance, or a 95% chance of drawing a sample with 0.87 more, or 0.87 or worse rate ratio. And in this case, it would actually be 0.87 or
It means you have a
less,
95%
or
chance of drawing no cancer, is like less than
Right.
1 times more. Yeah. So,
more accurate, I should restate that because I kind of stumbled over it. It's a 0.95% chance that you draw a sample that is 0.13, that has a rate ratio of 0.13 or more away from 1.
and that's among the quartile 4, which means the most exposed.
Right.
So even the most exposed still have these values.
Right.
Okay.
And that, you know, that what this thing should be doing, so that should be uniformly non-decreasing, which means it just, as you go up the quartiles, the rate ratio should be going up as well, to imply a you know, an increase. And I believe that P trend is actually applicable to all 4 of those categories.
Okay.
And not just the last one. But I'm not sure about that.
Oh, here's the lag numbers too for everybody's reference. Let me pull that up while we talk. Okay, is there anything else that you have that you wanted to call out or mention or talk about? Like what? And then we'll get to like your conclusions.
Well, I did want to go back to the p-hacking thing.
Oh, okay.
So that's one of the things that really screamed at me when I was looking at the study.
Okay.
Is they tested 25 different cancer types. So if they didn't correct for that, and again, they may have, I would hope they did, but if they didn't correct for that, then that would actually give you a 78% chance of having a type 1 error, being at least one significant result when none of them are significant.
And that would cause the study results to err on the side of over-predicting an association?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that would show a worse result if
Right.
they didn't compensate.
Right. And I'm going to, you know, in partly judging from what the p-values are here, the fact that they are that you do have these 93s and these 95s, I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt, assume that they did correct, but it still raises red flags because I didn't spot that anywhere.
Okay. So, can you kind of give us your conclusion? And you know, you're welcome to be as vague or as specific as you'd like. Is it a valid claim to say that there's no association between use of glyphosate and NHL? What does this study tell you?
The study doesn't tell me much.
Why not?
Well, okay, so I think it is. I would have to look at the other studies to really say that, because it could very well be that some more appropriately carried out studies gave significant results for what was it, acute myeloid leukemia. But as far as this study goes, it doesn't tell me anything. It first of all, one study doesn't really tell you much. That's part of science is that you, one of the requirements of science is that you repeat your study and you get significant results often enough that the probability of that significance not being true is really low. So one study is never sufficient because you only have this 1 out of, especially if you're using 0.05 as your p-value cutoff, you only have this 1 out of 20. It's still 1 out of 20 that even if you don't have any connection, that comes up. Mm-hmm. But if a study comes up, if it's properly done and it comes up with no connection, that's pretty good evidence, or that's pretty good indication that there probably isn't a connection. So what I would say is I would not say that it's necessarily valid to state that there is no connection with Roundup and cancer, but I do think it's valid to say there's probably no connection between.
Would you use Roundup? If that was
Roundup?
your day job, would you use it?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I think that's the answer. Like based on this, would you use Roundup?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I mean, not based on that, but based on that plus all of the other information that, you know,
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough.
Not in Texas, but that's just because it's too dang hot.
And you're leaving. He's leaving Dallas. So we've started at the top, and then we've worked down through all the layers. Kason, did you have any questions before I kind of close this out?
Yeah, I got one for you. So whenever it comes to the ruling in the court case, they awarded, what, $300 million to the guy. I wonder if there is a statistically significant answer, like if these numbers lined up this way, that it would be justifiable to force a company to pay any amount of money to any person because if it was 100%, well, then we can prove it happened. If it's 99.99%, we still can't prove that it happened, but we can be reasonably sure. I wonder, from both of y'all's perspective, where is the ethical line of using statistics to dole out justice to people?
You had to bring it back to ethics, didn't you? You had to bring it back to ethics.
Well, I can't talk intelligently about statistics, so I got to put it back in my court. So,
this brought to mind a conversation that I had with my doctor brother, who said that his job is to interpret and apply the results of these tests to save lives. And he says that like we talked about, the default sort of hypothesis that they're accepting in these studies is that there is no correlation. And he says that when human lives are at stake, it might, and he said might, I'm not going to put words in his mouth. He said that it might be smart to consider making the default assumption that there is a danger and then try and prove otherwise, which would make these results look different, right? Like, how would that change what we've seen here?
Well, that is mathematically untenable.
Ah, okay. Why?
Mathematically and logically untenable, because
snap. Now I need to get my
this
brother
falls
on.
into proving a negative.
Ah, okay.
So that's very much what
that makes sense.
That's the logical part. And mathematically, now there's this gets really mathy if you want to really go into it, because you can go to the
give us the.
Oh, I'm not going to go through it. Don't, trust me, because it would take an entire graduate course. But this goes into the, like, you can maybe argue from a Bayesian context versus most of these tests are done in what's called frequentist context, or the likelihood ratio context, but yeah, don't worry about it. But the short answer for
sounds better than French. That's all I'm thinking.
The short answer why you need to assume the negative is because the continuous probability of any single event is 0.
Okay.
So and this falls into normality, and if you have, because hypothesis tests are generally based, in a frequentist context again, they're generally based on assuming a single value, and you cannot prove a single value. You can only disprove a single value. This is why when you're speaking in terms of a hypothesis test, you never accept your null hypothesis. Your null hypothesis being the default, which is generally your statistic is either equal to 0 or equal to 1. And you cannot accept that because the probability of any single value is 0. That's essentially why. There's, because it's, but you cannot accept it because of that very reason. You can only reject or fail to reject your null.
Okay, and I'm not dodging the ethical question. I just wanted to bring up what my brother said, and that was a great response. That makes sense that you can't prove a negative.
Neither am I. I just tend to nerd out.
That is an interesting ethical question, though. So, at what confidence interval, what R and P value, is it safe to assign moral culpability for something? Let's assume there's 100% correlation. Let's assume we're 100% confident in some world that doesn't exist that we can somehow prove 1-to-1 for sure that this guy got cancer from this chemical put out by Monsanto. Let's start there and look at the ethics of that. So if we're sure that this chemical gave him cancer, is Monsanto responsible? I think that's a good starter question.
I would. I would tend to say no. And the reason is not because, like, I think there are probably some valid claims to, like the McDonald's hot coffee case. That was literally coffee that caused third-degree burns. And so there was actually a claim there. And even though, you know, yes, you assume it's hot coffee, you don't spill it on, but, you know, there was some issue there. It's like you don't expect coffee to be Hades hot. But I would say, in general, you do not use products that are specifically meant to kill things without taking heavy precautions.
So the answer would be, like, what warnings were on the label? Like, did they say, you know, wear gloves when you use this stuff? Did they say, you know, did he use it properly? Did he use it improperly? He said there was one instance where he was, like, covered in it or something like that. I'm pretty sure that's not in the instructions to cover yourself with it.
Right. Well, I mean, how does that happen? How does that happen where you end up covered in a weed killer? But even without warnings, even without saying, you know, hey, this is nasty stuff, it's specifically made to kill things. That should immediately say to you, maybe I don't want to pour this on me. Maybe I want to make sure that I take precautions. It's like ladders have 50 different warning labels on here, on there, because people are too dumb not to lean to the right when they're on a ladder.
Okay, so let's assume that, let's now, like, tighten it up even more. So let's assume that he followed every instruction to the T and never, like, didn't follow their warnings. And so, like, how do you sell a dangerous product without getting sued? Like, there are legitimate uses. I think this is your point. There are legitimate uses for dangerous products, things that can cause you harm. And if you choose to take up an occupation where you use those products, I'm not sure that you can put that on the person that you voluntarily purchased them from. Like, how is it their fault? I'm not catching that.
Right. Well, it's so if anything, maximally, I think it would be his employer's fault. Possibly. Maybe. Because he did not go through sufficient training to, you know, not pour chemicals on himself. But even then, you know, there's a certain amount of personal responsibility there.
And, well, I mean, in this study, so it's also, okay, so here's another layer. So we've gone all the way down. Let's kind of climb back out as we go. So a jury of people was asked to interpret what we just did while having a guy dying of cancer sitting right in front of them. Like, I'm still not even sure that I have a decent enough grasp of what we just talked about in this 1 out of 800 studies on the topic to make a determination of this kind. You ask, you know, a jury of laymen to do that while, you know, feeling sorry for this guy's kids that he's about to leave on their own. Like, is this method of justice even a valid one? The feelings of the jurors are now in charge of a massive amount of wealth for Monsanto, especially with all the you know, generally it seems like everyone I talk to, and it could just be, you know, this could be an invalid correlation based on my sample of friends, but a lot of people are down on Monsanto, and so if you get on a jury, you're gonna, you know, you're gonna be biased against them.
Well, there's a heavy bias against Monsanto, and I mean, basically anybody you talk to, but there's also another thing. There's this idea that corporations, since they can afford big time lawyers, they're automatically going to win court cases, you know, most of the time. But the reason, I'm relatively sure, at least, that the reason why suing big companies is untenable is because their lawyers actually draw out the legal battle so that the jury case doesn't actually happen. But people in general have an underdog bias. So when you come up against, when you go actually in court with a jury, with a person against a big company, I think normally that's actually going to, the jury is more likely to be biased towards the person. Now there are, you know, there is still that lawyer aspect to it where the lawyer can, you know, talk the jury in enough circles to convince them.
You know, jury selection, the voir dire, or whatever it's called.
Right.
Where where you can kick out jurors that aren't you don't think will be biased in your direction. It just seems like Monsanto, and you are biased against them. You said in the beginning, and I'm suspicious of them because a lot of people I trust are biased against them or don't like them. It seems like anybody. It seems like I should be able to sell a dangerous product to somebody and not have to be responsible for whatever happens. Like I should be able to sell a product and say, hey, that's dangerous. Be careful with it. I'm not responsible. And then you not be able to sue me. Like that seems like a failure of justice. What do you guys think? What do you think, Kason? Do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, I think no matter how you slice and dice this, the fundamental ethic that people who call themselves representatives of the government absolutely cannot enforce any amount of justice because 100% of their system is funded through monies that are taken through threats of force or actual force being administered on peaceful people. So that's as far as I would take the ethics, because I can't imagine this case happening in a society where there's not this giant monopolization of violence around the justice system, as it were. I kind of take your stance there, Patrick, whenever it comes to if somebody sells you a dangerous product and you buy it of your own free will, you're not forced to use it, you own the effects of your actions. You own the effects of that, even if it's destructive to yourself. So I cannot imagine, and this doesn't mean that it would never happen, but I cannot imagine a $300 million award going on in a free market arbitration over something of this caliber, personally.
Yeah, that would be insane. I mean, that whole aspect of it, well, the entire case is insane, but yeah, $300 million afforded or rewarded is asinine. But the
you can call it wrong.
Yeah, but yeah, I agree. I kind of approach this actually in terms of if this were a private arbitration issue, like how you might approach that. And also to clarify, I don't think the coffee case was properly decided either. And
that's the next video. We'll have you back. That sounds like a fun talk.
But yeah, I think there's something to be said also just for consumer vigilance, which has been completely thrown by the wayside.
It's not a thing anymore
in America. Yeah. So there's no consumer responsibility anymore.
Everything's so anti-corporation. Yeah. They blame them first. What do you guys think? Let us know in the comments. Let us know in the comments on all of the various platforms. Oh, and check these out. We haven't mentioned them in a long time. We do have a link in the description to our little swag store where we have some cool bumper stickers. This one's Vote Harder Plebs. We're coming up on voting season, so you might like that on your car. We also have the amazing little nugget of truth: government doesn't exist, people exist. So if you like these bumper stickers, go check out them on the store. I'm going to start, I think, making some more t-shirts. So if you guys have some cool t-shirt ideas related to things that we've talked about on the show, shoot me a note in the comments and we'll start getting them up. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope that this deep dive into the statistical world has provided you insight into why you have to be amazingly cautious when reading the news and when interpreting scientific studies, because it's really a set of skills that people have to get years of education to properly play in that sandbox, right? And just hearing this guy talk shows you like what a different world it can be and how much you have to understand to just read the conclusions and read the summary of these studies. So thanks for being. Okay, really quick, before we end the show, just interruption. I want to remind people that the Patreon supporters, you can check it out on patreon.com/Disenthrall, get access to special unavailable to the public after show recordings where oftentimes we get in these really engaging conversations with people on the show, but the show has kind of a time limit. We can't talk for hours and hours, and so after we stop recording, we usually continue talking about whatever it is we're talking about, and some of the conversations are really cool. We just had one here with Phil. It was 15-20 minutes of additional interesting information about things that we didn't get to in the show. Our Patreon supporters, we save that content for them, so make sure you check out the Patreon. Thanks for being on the show. I hope we can have you back soon, wherever you end up living in the country. I enjoyed it. Thanks for watching.